welcome to the latest episode of The Invisible Men. My name is Ian Rowe, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and also the CEO of Vertex Partnership Academies, our great high school in the Bronx.
Hello, I'm Nick Ohnell Fellow, a member of the Leadership Network at AEI and an adjunct professor at both Rice Business School and the Olin Business School at Washington University.
Nique, great to see you. As our listeners know, we love to feature, what we call invisible men, men who are doing great work around the country, around the world, in fact, whose work deserves even more eyeballs, more attention, and I'm so excited to introduce someone who falls very much in this category, Rafael Mangual, who is at the Manhattan Institute, in fact, the Nick Ohnell Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's a great writer. If you could read his work in City Journal, he's been published all over the place. A couple of years ago, he wrote his first book, Criminal Injustice. Can't wait to talk to you about what the reaction has been to that book and just some emerging work you've done and some of the underlying factors driving crime and what we need to do to address it. Full disclosure, Ralph is married to Joyanette Mangual, equally an amazing person who also happens to be the founding principal at Vertex Partnership Academy. So I'm deep within the Mangual family.
She's by far the more impressive one. Absolutely.
Yes. I'd have her on the show, but we call it the Invisible Men. So,
That's right. That's right.
So, Ralph, thanks for joining us. And
Thank you.
Before we get to all the professional accolades and the really important work you're doing around crime, just tell us a little bit about you growing up, just some experiences you had, and when you realized that race, ethnicity, this is a thing, my skin color actually means something. Yeah.
So that's an interesting, yeah. So I mean, I'm born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. Grew up in the late 80s and 90s there. And in the mid 90s, my family moved us out to Long Island. So, kind of spent the first part of my childhood in inner city New York, and then the second part of my childhood in suburban Long Island. And that's actually the answer to your question, which is when I kind of became aware that race was a thing. It was upon that move to Long Island. So I, went to a Catholic school in Brooklyn. Most of the, other students and the kids that I hung out with in my neighborhood were, Puerto Rican, Black. Everyone, kind of looked like me. I never really thought about race. It wasn't until we moved to Long Island and I went to an all-white school that I became really conscious of my race for the first time. And it was somewhat negative, the experiences. I remember the first day of school, you had to wait on the line outside your classroom before you went in. And I was waiting on the line and some kid came up to me. I won't say who it was. And he said, are you the kid from Brooklyn?
Wow.
So it was like, haven't even been in school 5 minutes yet. And, clearly people have been talking. And then the next question was, are you better than so-and-so at basketball? Which was hilarious to me for a couple of reasons. One, I was 10.
10.
And so I'd never met the person they were asking about, had no idea whether I was better at him than basketball. Didn't even really like basketball all that much. I was a baseball player. And so that was kind of, I remember going home and talking to my parents and being like, this is really weird. I'm getting weird vibes. And then, within a couple weeks, got called a few names on the playground, had a few scraps, and, kind of went from there. But that was the first time that I kind of became aware, of my own race. But even despite that, I mean, I don't think I really got into the race discussion until I got to college. That was when I realized that race was a political issue, and particularly one that mattered to me. And
how did it manifest itself at school?
Well, there's one moment in particular that that was really important for me. But I think it's important to tell a story that kind of led up to that moment first. So, I think in part, this is me kind of psychoanalyzing myself in a kind of backward looking way. But I think because of the early experiences I had when we moved out to Long Island, I really kind of threw myself into this racial identity that like sort of fully manifested hip hop culture in an outward way in every way that I could, right? I mean, I had cornrows and I wore do-rags and I got in a lot of fights and hung out with kids who ended up going to jail and prison and, not the greatest, most productive way to kind of deal with those emotions for sure. But a story that I tell in my book that, I think was kind of the start of the turning point for me was I was with some friends. We were out at the mall. It's what you do in the suburbs. You go and you walk around the mall even though you don't have money to shop. Right. And, there's just like 5 or 6 of us and we're all kind of thugged out and, in our streetwear, we're walker wear and, do-rags and all that stuff. And I remember we were walking down this long corridor and here come like 5 or 6 white kids and, they're very preppy dressed. And I just remember that we kind of like really leaned into this sort of intimidation thing. And, the kids that we were walking past all kind of looked away, wouldn't make eye contact. And like once we got about 100 feet between us, all of our friends, we kind of giggled. We had a good laugh. We knew exactly what we were doing. We knew exactly what had just happened. We knew that we had induced fear, and we got off on that, right? We really liked it. But a few days later, I was at a local deli getting a breakfast sandwich in the morning, and I had same uniform I always have on, right? The baggy jeans, the long white tee, the Timberland boots untied, and the do-rag, and I got my headphones blaring, and I get online behind this woman, and she kind of clutches her purse. You could tell she's like trying to do it discreetly, but I remember initially being offended, right? It was like, who's this woman? Why does she think that I'm a danger to her?
Yeah.
But that quickly gave way to like, I don't know, this internal dialogue I was having where it was like, I just remembered that day at the mall, which was, a week before that maybe. And it was like, we were perfectly happy to induce the very same reaction in a different group of people. And that we weren't offended. We were happy. Like we had accomplished something. And I just remember thinking like, actually, this is me putting this out, right? Like by design, I don't really have a right to feel offended, because one person took it away that I didn't want them to take it. I can't control how people take it. I can only control the message. And it's very clear the message I'm putting out. I just remember having this sort of conversation with myself. And that was the first time I started to kind of move away, from that mode of being. And, I got to college a few months later, and in a sociology class, we had a guest speaker who came in, and he was an ex-con. He had been incarcerated under the Rockefeller drug laws, which were New York's mandatory minimums.
Yeah.
And he gave this diatribe about how the New York City Police Department was racist and how the criminal justice system was racist. And the only reason he did the time he did was because he was a man of color. And I just remember looking around. It was like,
Wow.
250 people in a freshman seminar class, and everyone's nodding their head. And I just remember thinking, like, no one believes this, right? I mean, like, I didn't know him, but I knew him, right? I had friends like him, there were people in the hood like him. It's like, he knew what he was doing, and I'm just looking around and everyone seemed to buy this sob story. That was the first time that I kind of realized that I was different, but I also didn't have the vocabulary with which to push back. And that was the very first time that I felt pressure to perform academically. That was the very first time I felt personally insecure about not being able to engage intellectually with my peers. I mean, I'd never really taken school seriously up until that point, which may be surprising to people because I'm a think tank fellow and I write books and, do a lot of studying now, but I wasn't a great student. And it was because of, I just had a really bad attitude about it. But, I was a jock, I played sports. All that mattered to me was that, I was popular with my friends. I had a girlfriend and, I had a six pack and could play baseball really well. That was it.
Right.
Everyone else was a nerd. I never cared to do well in school up until that point. And, so I started doing my own research. And over the next, kind of 2 years, I kind of threw myself headfirst into this body of work that I started to become resentful about because I had never been exposed to it. I was 2 years into college and no one had ever mentioned the name Thomas Sowell to me. I had to find that on my own. No one had ever mentioned William F. Buckley. No one had ever mentioned, on the crime stuff, James Q. Wilson and George
Right.
Killing and John DeLulio and all these people whose work and I just remember becoming really resentful about my education and thinking that it wasn't an education, that I was being manipulated, and I kind of really took it to heart. And so that was the sort of beginning of the end, so to
Oh,
speak.
yeah.
So
Well, let me and Nike, I know you have a question too, which is but in defense of those 200 or so of your fellow students who are sitting there, the pull is to have empathy for this guy, right?
right,
The
right,
pull is to say, look at him. He's standing here. He's fine. He's civil. It must have been the system, and I will gain points by feeling empathy and believing this man's story,
right.
right? Like, how do you fight against that? Because the natural tendency is to, in a sense, almost absolve him of whatever it was that he had been imprisoned for.
I mean, for me, it was just so clearly and patently untrue. I mean, I think part of it was just my experience with other people like him. I mean, one of my really close friends in high school went to prison for drugs. One of my best friends growing up, who's also a cousin, went to prison for a lot. Like he made a choice. I knew he made a choice. He knew he made a choice at the moment he made that choice. So to me, it was like it wasn't hard at all, because the difficult thing would have been to buy into the lie that was so obvious. And that was what was so frustrating to me and made me feel so at odds with my peers, and like I didn't fit, because it really wasn't an excruciating process to talk myself out of this natural thing. No, what was natural to me was that this guy was full of it. And it would have taken a lot for me to sort of contort myself into repeating that lie. It's just not really who I am. I also think, look, I'm a strange guy in a lot of ways, right? I mean, I'm quite a naturally pugilistic. I don't mind going against the grain. I'm not particularly easily embarrassed. Never had a fear of disagreeing with people. Wasn't anti-conflict, so to speak. So yeah, I guess I'm just a little different. But
Yep.
yeah, it wasn't difficult at all for me.
So I know that you spent some time in Chicago, I believe, for law
Yep,
school. I
that's
want
right.
to get your observations on Chicago, and specifically, I want to get your perspective on why that magnificent city, continues to elect mayoral leadership that just doesn't seem to understand how to unlock the greatness of that city. What's going on there?
My working theory for a long time was that one of the reasons you had such bad policy in a city like Chicago was because it was so segregated. The well-to-do, politically active class never really had to suffer the consequences of their political choices, which is to say that crime basically stayed on the south and west sides of the city, never really bled into the spaces that the donor class frequented, where they lived. That's starting to change a little bit, and I also think you're starting to see a little bit of a change in the political dynamic. Although in a city that's that deep blue, one of the things I think also that's going on is just this kind of perverse commitment to progressive ideology that is blinding in a way. Um, I think people have convinced themselves of the lie that I refused to buy that day in sociology class, which is that, to the extent that criminal perpetration is a problem, it's not the fault of the perpetrators. I think, the people, who are sympathetic to the Brandon Johnsons of the world genuinely, although misguidedly, believe that people who pull triggers, who sell drugs, who assault, who rob, are victims themselves of their circumstances, that they didn't really have agency, to take a word from our beloved host here. And, that's a very powerful thing, for a couple of reasons. One is that it allows you to sing the praises of your own virtue, right? I mean, it puts you in a position both of superiority, right? Because, well, these poor people couldn't help it. And,
Yep.
they're not in the position that I was in, which means that you're looking down from on high. But it allows you to sort of maintain that position of superiority in a way that's not as, grotesque as it would be if it were kind of brash and in your face, right? So it's
Yeah.
like, I'm still superior, but I'm also empathetic, and therefore I'm a good person. And I'm someone that you should listen to. And I think that's, it's a sort of sick psychology, really, because at the end of the day, there's this carnage, and I saw it firsthand while I was in Chicago. I mean, one of the scariest moments of my life was in the city of Chicago. My now wife and I, at the time fiance, were in our car. We had just dropped her mother off after going out for dinner and a movie, and we were stopped at a red light when a car on the opposite side of the light, the driver got out and opened fire in our direction at a car that was passing us on the wrong side of the road. I mean, I thought he'd be shooting at us at first. And it was, it was incredibly scary, incredibly disorienting. We didn't even think to duck. I mean, it was just, the shock of like this happening. It was like, is that a gun? Is he shooting? What's that? It's like, and before you can process it, it's all over. And it was like, you could actually hear the bullets whizzing past the car. And it's like, well, we came that close to, being shot or being killed over what? It's like, what could possibly possess someone to open fire indiscriminately that way? I mean, obviously, they were shooting at whoever was in the car that was passing us on the wrong side of the road, who seemed to know that they were about to be shot at because they took off and ran the light that we were waiting for. But, that was a neighborhood that we didn't spend a ton of time in, because we were fortunate enough to live in a much nicer part of the city. But even frequenting that neighborhood for as little time as we did to visit family, we were almost victims of gun violence in a really terrible way. And it's like, imagine the people who live there every day,
All the time.
who
Absolutely.
spend every minute, every hour. And I think it's just really difficult for people who don't have any real proximity to that to imagine what that life is like. And that's the thing that I've always struggled with. It's like, well, how is it that you can find it in yourself to express empathy for the person who pulls the trigger, but that empathy isn't overridden by the empathy for the people who are stuck living in the neighborhoods
Yeah.
that are terrorized by exactly those kinds of individuals. And I can't claim to understand it, but
Yeah.
all I can do is theorize.
Yeah, I know this is what drives a lot of your work, which is to protect the actual victims who are
Right.
living in these communities. Let me share something with you, because you said something interesting. These people who kind of, the apologists, like, well, these kids they're just victims of circumstance, and therefore they didn't have agency. What I actually find, I can actually say I do believe these folks are victims of circumstance, in the sense of, did they grow up in a fatherless home? Did they not have access to high quality schools? Was there no faith commitment in their life? So it actually can be true that they're in an environment that has led them, that has
Absolutely.
created an environment where the choices that they make can actually weirdly be rational, but you can still be held accountable for the actions that you ultimately take. And this is what I find fascinating about your work, because you're trying to connect the role of these mediating institutions, the importance of family, the importance of faith, the importance of getting access to good schools, as our strategy for affecting and reducing things like crime.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, it really is kind of funny. I mean, we were starting to talk about it offline before we started, but, you mentioned my book that came out, it was a couple of years ago now, so we're, fully off the book tour. But I did a lot of speaking engagements around the country in the year that followed the publication, and probably 100 events. And it was interesting. Every once in a while, you'd have people in the audience that weren't necessarily friendly to my point of view, and I'd get hostile questions relatively regularly. And I'm also someone who enjoys debate, and so
Yeah,
I'll
right,
almost always accept invitations, to be the conservative foil at Berkeley recently, for example.
right.
And I kept getting the same question from people. Part of the book pushes back on this idea that criminals are driven to crime by virtue of their socioeconomic circumstances, by virtue of their experiencing poverty or, being in an area with high levels of income inequality, or suffering from high levels of unemployment. And I reject those explanations, particularly for violent criminal behavior. I do think that the research shows that there's some connection between socioeconomic status and property offending, things that have sort of pecuniary motivations. But you don't get richer by shooting someone. You don't get richer by assaulting someone. You don't get richer by raping someone. I mean, violent crime by and large is an expression of power and dominance, and I think is really rooted in psychology more than anything else. But I spend a good part of the book sort of pushing back on the idea that crime is a function of these socioeconomic factors. But the book also deals with the race question. In fact, the last chapter is called "The Elephant in the Room," and sort of tackles the systemic racism critique. And I offer a lot of arguments up in that chapter. But one of the stronger arguments, I think, is the fact that a lot of the racial disparities that motivate the reform movement, right, disparities in enforcement, are driven by and large by disparities in behavior. And once you control for those disparities in behavior, you start to find it very difficult to find evidence of discriminatory intent undergirding the disparities that we see in enforcement. And so I would get this question, it was like, okay, well, if you don't buy that crime is a function of poverty, for example, but you also don't buy the systemic racism critique because you think that it's overblown in light of the fact that, say Black males commit more crime on average than their white male counterparts.
That's the honest truth.
Right. But then they kind of take it a step further and they say, well, aren't you then saying that there's something inherent about Black males or Hispanic males that makes them more criminal than other groups if you don't think their criminality is explained by this particular kind of structural explanation? And I was always kind of befuddled by that question, but I got it enough times to realize that actually maybe it deserves a sort of a concrete, a long form answer, which I'm working on now. But there is a structural explanation that I think works here, and you hinted at it just now, Ian. I think a big part of that structural explanation is family. One of the things that we know is that there's a massive disparity, particularly between Black and white children in terms of out of wedlock births. So about 70% of Black kids are born to an unwed mother. It's about 26% for white children. Both those numbers are high, but that's a massive disparity. Right, it's close to a 3x disparity. That's meaningful. Mm-hmm. Now, how is that related to crime? And this is the thing that I don't think people have done enough thinking about. But in essence, the short version of the argument is that when you are born into a single parent household, particularly a single mother household, and that's actually an important point because you don't see the same negative results with single father households, at least not for males. So what you see when kids are born into single-parent households is that they are supervised at lower rates. They experience higher levels of parental conflict. They are more likely to be subjected to harsh parenting styles, cold parenting styles. They are more likely to endure high levels of stress, more likely to be abused and neglected. Domestic violence exposure, parental drug use exposure, the list goes on, right? So we know that single parent family structures are associated with significantly higher rates of children experiencing what the sociological research calls ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And what we know about adverse childhood experiences is that they actually predict conduct problems in early childhood. And when I say conduct problems, I'm referring to conduct disorders, which is a clinical term, right? A conduct disorder is a diagnosable psychological condition, whose factors are laid out in the DSM. But it's diagnosable as early as age 5 in some cases, right? Between 5 and 8, you can identify a kid as conduct disordered. Now, kids who come from single-parent households are significantly more likely to be conduct disordered in early childhood. And a huge subset of kids who are conduct disordered in early childhood will will stay conduct disordered through adolescence, but will have those disorders metastasize into more serious kind of what are called cluster B personality disorders. Things like substance use disorders, antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. Why is that important? Well, things like substance use disorders and antisocial personality disorder in particular are very, very common in criminal offending populations, much more so than they are in the general population. So if you look at the United States and you looked at the general population of men, about 2 to 4% of men will be diagnosed as antisocial personality disorder. In prison settings, the estimates range from 40 to 70% of prisoners, depending on the facility
Wow.
that's been surveyed in the research. Right?
Wow.
So that's more common than poverty. That's more common than experiencing high levels of it. Right? So there are these, I think, very strong associations to psychological conditions that are much better explainers of criminal behavior. And I think that there's a strong relationship, and I know that there's a strong relationship between those psychological conditions and the structure of the family that you were raised in. And so, you were right to say that these children can become victims of their circumstances insofar as they end up going down the road of criminality. But those circumstances are the byproduct of bad choices, often on the part of their parents. There's really only one way to stop that cycle, which is to interrupt the intergenerational transmission of that kind of antisocial behavior. How do you do that? In part by enforcing the law, which is one of the reasons why I don't think decarceration and depolicing are answers, even if you buy this sort of structural explanation. But you also do that by encouraging better, more stable family structures through public policy to the extent possible that you can do that. Although, as Ian knows, I think there are a lot of limits as to what the government can do, on that front, but also just in the way that we all live our lives, right? And it's one of the reasons why I love this podcast, because, there is an extent to which, men of color, that term brings to mind not people who are successful and thriving and normal and middle class, right? But when you say, oh, he's a person of color, I think a lot of people, the first thing they think of is someone who's struggling, someone who's experienced a high level of disadvantage. And I think we need to get past that. And, the more that we can do that, the more that we can, get people to understand that, normal, stable, upper middle class lives are not only attainable, but extremely likely if you just make the right choices, particularly as parents when your children are young, because I think the intervention window is very, very small to get kids on the right track, and that's the dark side of the research, which is that once a kid's kind of delinquent in adolescence,
It's hard to get back.
There's not a ton that you can do, at least in the way of psychological interventions, and that's the thing that I think is really hard for a lot of people to swallow, especially good people want to feel like they can help, right? They want to feel positive, like there's something that they can do. And, again, it's not to say that these children are lost causes. That's not at all what I'm saying. I do think there are things that do show some promise, right? There's some short-term effects in cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, that are somewhat positive, although they're not particularly sticky. But there's a lot that we can do to invest in trying to figure out what potential interventions might work. But until then, I think we really have to prioritize those early years. And, the more that we can educate future parents about, the importance of that window, I think, the better the outcomes will be.
So, Ralph, I thought your root cause logic was really exceptional and gave me a few more things to think about. The thing I do not understand, and I want to get your perspective on, is when child welfare is brought up. You name the forum, TV, podcasts, X. It's so rare for these so-called experts to talk about fathers. Why don't they talk about fathers?
Well, I think part of it is that for them to do so would be to implicitly condemn the way of life of people that they see as victims. And that would be punching down, and that would be racist, and that would be socially unacceptable. I don't think people are comfortable with that anymore, and I think racial dynamics have a lot to do with that. we live in a majority white country. But I think a lot of white people in this country feel uneasy about passing judgment about things like how you raise your children, about how you form your family. And so they stay silent. And in fact, sometimes they do worse than that. Not only do they stay silent, but they also positively affirm these alternative ways of living life. Meanwhile, they follow, the steps that we all know work in their own lives, which is just, I think makes them not only cowards, but also makes them hypocrites.
Wow. Wow. How do you like how do we change that? Because at some point we have to confront reality, right? Because there's fears of being canceled or saying the wrong thing or virtue signaling. But the people being hurt by these ideologies where you absolve behavior because of these structural forces, it's the it's principally kids of color. How do we break this cycle? Because it's the work I know that you've committed your life to. I've
Yeah.
committed my life to, Nike, all of us.
I mean, look, it's a hard question. I think, ultimately it really comes down to telling the truth as best as you can, being fearless. I mean, we're all fortunate insofar as we're in positions that we're not going to get canceled because of what we say, right? I mean, the Manhattan Institute isn't going to, fire me for, publishing work that, concludes, something that might be unpopular on the progressive left and that might have gotten me fired from, say, Google or someplace like that. So, I think we have a particularly intense responsibility to tell the truth as loudly and as widely as we possibly can. And I think the hope is that ultimately gives permission to other
Mm.
people in their regular lives to be a little bit more outspoken. And you do that through confrontation, through a battle of ideas. The problem with that is that it's a slow process. We're not going to get change overnight. And that can be frustrating in part because of how quickly some of the negative changes that we now lament came about, right? I mean, just talking about family structure, 70% of Black children are born to an unwed mother now. But in 1965, when the Moynihan Report was written, that number was 24%. So it went from 24% to 70% in a matter of about a
Right.
generation.
And
Because
he
there's
was
about
calling it a crisis. He was
he
calling
was
it a
calling it a
crisis.
crisis in 1965 when it was, less than half of what the rate is now.
And by
Um,
the way, interestingly, the white non-marital birth rate when he wrote that was about 5%. In the
right.
white community, the non-marital birth rate is higher
That's
than
right.
crisis levels today. It's higher today than it was the crisis levels that Moynihan was pointing out in the Black community. So, it's what I call equal opportunity
That's
tsunami,
right. That's
which
right.
I
Yeah.
hope is like an opportunity for all people to recognize that this is not solely a racial problem in terms of negative impact.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, I think, if you're talking about a white child or a Hispanic child or an Asian child who was born into that unstable family structure and exposed to the same kinds of traumas and adversities that we know are associated with those unstable family structures, the outcomes are going to be the same, right? I mean, there's not a ton of different. There's nothing that makes it particularly likely that criminality is a likely outcome for a Black child who has those same experiences, but not for a white child. That's not what the research says. It just so happens that Black children are experiencing these adversities at higher rates, at least right now, and that I think explains a big chunk of the disparity in things like crime and other life outcome gaps that we see. And I think ultimately that those negative outcomes are exacerbated by a sort of hip hop subculture that elevates violence, socially. It elevates violence as a legitimate means of acquiring respect. It elevates violence as a legitimate means of resolving disputes, and child rearing to some extent, right? I mean, there's this ongoing dialogue that you see in a lot of quote unquote Black comedy, to the extent that there is such a thing, where there's a lot said about differences in parenting styles along racial lines, and how disputes are resolved along racial lines. In fact, in the book, I highlight a couple of comedic bits. One from Cedric the Entertainer during the King's Comedy, probably more well known. Where he talks about how funny it was watching all the white people coming back into the theater and realizing that black people had taken their seats, and the fear of the confrontation, because the presumption was that the black people would get violent if they were confronted, and it was all laughs and giggles, and but that's a
There's
cultural
something to
artifact,
it.
that bit. That's a cultural artifact, that bit, and it's an old one, right? I mean, Richard Pryor made the same joke during one of his comedy specials when he first got on stage, and so I don't think that's a particularly positive aspect of hip hop culture that I think also needs to change, and I do think it exacerbates some of the outcomes that we know are tied to these other structural factors.
All right.
Well, Ralph, we have a section of the podcast that we call the speed round. I'm going to throw out a few names and ask you to pick a side and tell
Okay.
us why. I'm
Okay.
going to start with Malcolm or Martin.
Martin. Malcolm was too angry, too separatist. It's not positive. Seeing we talk about othering a lot, but there was an embrace of othering within, I think, the black community at that time, and I think ultimately it was detrimental. One of my favorite writers on race is Thomas Sowell, and the first book of his that I read was The Economics and Politics of Race: An International Perspective. And it really opened my eyes because he spent the first chunk of the book talking about geographical factors and how
Mm,
that influences
mm,
inequality.
yep.
And one of the things that always stood out to me was how he talked about, consistently in every region of the world, people who were raised, in the valleys of mountain ranges those societies tended to be significantly more backward than societies, say, that were near a coastal line that had natural ports. And I think the reason for that is that those places experienced trade at much higher levels because it was geographically easier, and you had more cultural diffusion, more exposure to other cultures from which you could adopt the positive attributes that you came across and improve. And what I think the sort of separatist kind of movement did was it caused self-insulation in a way that not only didn't allow but affirmatively critiqued cultural assimilation in that same way, right? This idea of talking white, of acting white, of, sort of betraying, what it means to be authentically black, I think has a lot to do with that sort of separatist mindset, that this sort of insular view of a racial group from within. And I think that was incredibly, incredibly negative.
Thank you. Elon Musk or Steve Jobs?
That's a tough one. Steve Jobs did did some pretty incredible things for communication. I mean, look, I think Elon Musk ultimately, because what he's doing for free speech right now is incredible. I mean, the amount of sacrifice, just the actual dollar amount that he sacrificed in service of that particularly important principle, I think, is one of the most admirable things I've seen sort of incredibly wealthy person do, certainly in my lifetime.
And in the spirit of free speech and discussion, Joe Rogan or Tucker Carlson?
Joe Rogan, 100%. First off, to me, stand-up comedy is the highest art form, so he wins for that alone. But I actually just wrote a piece in the New York Post over the weekend about the rise of podcasts. But I think he's really been a pioneer in what I think will be the single most important media form moving forward, and that's the long-form podcast. And the reason I think that is because you can't really fake your way through 2 or 3 hours of conversation.
Exactly.
You can definitely do it through a 6-minute cable news TV hit, but not a 2-hour conversation. I think he saw that early on, and that's changed our society for the better.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think consumers are now going to demand it. I think we're just going to demand, no, these little edited, interviews, which is much more
Yep,
about the producer than it is what the content is of the person actually saying it, and then just let it play.
I think that's
Just let it
exactly
play.
right.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Well, Ralph, as always, your work is so amazing. I always think that you have the ability to connect especially given your own personal background, your own personal story, one of the things that Nique and I, 30 years ago when we launched the Invisible Men, mini documentary, was that we were concerned with these kids, black male, black boys who weren't getting exposure to the kinds of ideas like you're talking about Thomas Sowell. You would never like a lot of black boys have never even heard of Thomas Sowell. In fact, a lot of these black critical race theorists have
That's
never
right.
heard of Tom Sowell. I did a debate, and this person asked me, "Who's Thomas Sowell?"
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
so, but I want to
That
ask
is so embarrassing.
yeah, one of the
Well, it should be anyway.
yeah, I know she should be embarrassed.
That's
One of
right.
the things we like to ask our guests is, what advice would you give to Daryl, who's this imaginary 16-year-old black kid living in forgotten USA, who's only hearing the narrative of George Floyd, or your
Yeah.
life is going to be, your life is not going to be your own. You live in an oppressive society. You're not going to be successful. The systems are rigged against you. What do you say? What do you say to a kid like that? To help expand their horizon.
I know what I'd say. I don't know if they'd listen, but I'd say get out of the hood as often as you can. Go, take a few hours instead of going to your local, corner store for a sandwich. Take the subway a few stops. Go, if you're living in East Harlem, go down to the Upper East Side for lunch. Take advantage of the sort of cultural enrichment experiences that your city has to offer. And I can tell you, I used to volunteer at a charter school on the south side of Chicago in Inglewood, which is a really rough neighborhood. And I can tell you how many kids had never been to downtown Chicago. They, 16, 17, 18 years old, lived in Chicago their whole lives, never been to the Bean, never been to the Art Institute, never been north of 95th Street. It's like, there's a whole world out there. It's not as far away as you think. And I think you'll be surprised at not just what you'll learn, but how accepted you'll be if you just let your guard down and go out there. And I think those experiences have the best hope of demystifying, for lack of a better term, white success in a way that I think will make middle classhood seem a lot more accessible. Um, the you know, and the reason I say that is just because I think the two most important experiences in my life were moving to Long Island, as unpleasant as it was socially at the outset, and working at my grandfather's tailor shop in Soho. And the reason for that is when I moved to Long Island, that was the first time that students in my class had parents who were well-to-do. So and so's parents are doctors or lawyers or whatever. And that was the first time that I remember. I'll never forget this. It was in seventh grade. We were getting a test back in English class, and I had gotten, I think, like an 86 or an 87 or something like that. But I remember the person behind me. I kind of everyone peeks to see what everyone else got. I think they got an 81. But I knew that at least one of her parents was a doctor. And I remember thinking like, the kids of doctors usually are the ones that become doctors, but I got a better grade than the kid of a doctor. So maybe I could. I said that was the first time I was able to sort of compare
Wow.
myself to people in that space. None of my friends' parents, back in Brooklyn had, really real careers or that sort of thing. So that was one. But working at my grandfather's tailor shop in Soho, you had a very sort of high-end clientele, right? Most of the people that came to drop off their dry cleaning and stuff were, they worked on Wall Street. You'd see them, I'd work there usually on the weekends. And so on a Sunday morning, guy would come, you could still smell the alcohol on him from the night before. And it just kind of, he'd have like his, Harvard crew t-shirt on and he dropping off a $2,000 Brioni suit. And I just remember thinking like, oh, like this is the upper echelon. That's not that impressive. Like you'd have a conversation, like whatever you talk, sports or the weather. I just remember thinking like, oh, like these are just normal
Yep.
people. But before that, it would have seemed foreign to me. If you would have said, oh, you're going to have a conversation with an Ivy League graduate, I'd been like terrified. I wouldn't have known what to say. But it was through those kind of repetitive experiences that I realized that we're not as far away from one another um, as I thought we were. And so, yeah, that's what I would tell them. Get out, see the world beyond, the 12 block radius of your hood. It's
Yep.
out there. There's a lot to find. And, you might find that your future life is going to be outside that radius, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. It's a beautiful world out there.
It
Yeah.
is.
Every Daryl needs to know that. Well, Ralph, thank you so much for the work that you do that's trying to create greater access to that beautiful world, and just breaking down these myths of in particular crime, what the factors are, because depending on your theory of causality, then that affects your theory of the interventions that you put forth. And
100%.
and if you just believe that everything's structural and people have no agency, there's never any hope of creating empowering strategies for people to lift themselves out of the situations that they find themselves in. So thank you again for the great work. And
Thank
with
you.
that, we've just ended another episode of The Invisible Men. All of our episodes can be seen on www.invisible.men. So with that, my name is Ian Rowe.
Ralph, thank you. I'm just so happy that you are at the Manhattan Institute,
Means the world. Thank you.
doing exceptional work. Thank you.
I
Yep.
appreciate it.
Onward. All right, my friend.